Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of Start at Zero. I'm AV, the founder and CEO at Avero Advisors. We are an independent consulting firm focusing on local governments across the United States. And with me, we have Robert, who is our principal of strategic initiatives. Um, and the topic today is pretty pertinent. We both were on client sites last week talking about ERP modernization and AI and agentic workforces and microsas and all the cool stuff that we're doing with our clients. And one thing kept coming up no matter where we went is grants. And several different aspects to this. One is that grant management is an often overlooked capability within any ERP system. Yeah, you may have the ability to modify something to track your grants, but it's a pretty specialized sort of workflow, and it depends on where your grants are coming from, who you are, what kind of agency. And the second thing is, how do you actually apply for these grants? Everyone talks about so many grants available from the feds for so many different things, and no one seems to exactly know how to go about them. It somehow become a specialized skill to write grants. And I think we can tie this into the third aspect, which is AI based grants tracking and grant application programs that can easily make these processes very streamlined for you. So with that, Robert, what's your opening sort of statement on this topic we're discussing today?
Most organizations do not have a good handle on their grant tracking. If they do have a grant manager, it's usually one person. And even really sizable organizations, like very large counties, it tends to be like one person. So you've got a bottleneck there. Um, one of the big themes for me is being proactive rather than reactive. It's one thing to chase the grant once it becomes available. There's a lot that organizations can do proactively to get that grant money secured ahead of time. And if you lobby for that, most organizations have an intergov. Someone's named as an intergov. It's usually an assistant city manager or county manager that's responsible for liaising with legislature, with the regional community, with organizations neighboring you. Maybe you're a county and you've got a major city inside. So you can work that into that so that the grant funding process doesn't become this in a lot of ways, you give them the answers as to how to build the grant so that you can respond to it easily. These are the areas that I still see organizations continuing to struggle when it comes to managing their grants. So very pertinent. We're going to talk about this today.
So when you say get ahead of the grant, right? It's almost as if you're talking RFPs. When we respond to RFPs, if it's on the street, it may be too late to make any impact with the decision makers there. Is it the same for grants?
Yeah, life's a lot easier when you help build the grant in the first place, when you give the input, when you get the attention of a county board, or it could even be someone who's lobbying on behalf of certain things. In a lot of organizations, they hire lobbyists. Government entities hire lobbyists, not only at the federal level, but they also do at the local level as well. It's just a lot easier if you get input into it and you steer the grant in the direction it needs to go. Especially if you've already identified issues within your region that are not just affecting you, but they're affecting multiple organizations. Just like you're exactly right with the RFP. If we know what's going on ahead of time and we help craft the main points of what you're looking to do with that RFP, it's a lot easier for people to respond and get that on track. There really is no substitute for that. I know there's a lot of people out there going, I don't have time. Maybe I don't know how to do that. Do the proactive work. A lot of lead time can be built into these grants as well. So the quicker you can get this to people's attention, the quicker you can solve an issue, especially ERP. If your organization is already suffering with a poor ERP product for whatever reason, there's a variety of reasons, getting ahead of that and getting that budgeted correctly is going to save you a heck of a lot of time.
Yeah, and it's a great time for me to plug the upcoming book, Start at Zero, which talks about a lot of these fundamental issues that plague ERP projects. And I know we're talking about grants, but make that connection again, right, Robert? What is the connection between starting at zero when it comes to setting up your organization and your workflows for success for an ERP implementation, and what you just said about grants? Because you can use grants to pay for large modernization efforts.
You need to have a foundation of discovery and understanding where you are and where your organization needs to go. Do you have to go deeply into that? Not necessarily, but a lot of organizations don't even know what they're going to be asking for. And just the we need to replace our ERP is not going to work. And you can put the burden on your IT department to get you a really good picture as to what this looks like. Because grants are not only just for hardware. A lot of people think grants are just for one-time purchases of hardware. No, it's the complete opposite, actually, especially when it comes to cybersecurity. So before you even step to the table to start talking about grants and getting your legislature or your local county or your regional cooperative to start putting these funds together and identifying them, you need to state what the need is. What are you looking to solve? And most organizations are still struggling with cybersecurity. And many organizations, unless they're incredibly happy with their ERP, they're already starting to question, what are we actually getting out of this product? Is it worth putting money into continuously, or is it time to look for something better? You have to have a good foundation of that before you can really start this process.
Yeah, and again, goes back to defining the vision, understanding what it is that you want out of this, because you can get the money, right? That's the easy part. If you fill out the forms right and do all the things and justify what you're trying to do, and we've seen grant applications before that are sort of wishy-washy. They end up getting the grant, and how many stories do you know of grants that were received, spent, but did nothing in the realm of the output that was expected from that money?
Yeah, tied to a goal, tied to a vision, tied to an outcome. That's the only way you're going to be able to demonstrate that the grant was well placed. You're exactly right. And even in my background in public safety, there were a lot of grants out there, well-meaning grants that were put out, but organizations didn't quite know how to effectively staff those. A lot of organizations, because their grant funding is very poorly tracked, they leave a lot of money on the table because they're just taking a guess that, I think we've gotten close to fulfilling this grant amount. So even just getting a grant that allows you to improve your grant tracking, I mean, what a brilliant idea, right? Some sort of grant-based funding that allows you to get a handle on your grant funding and really extract the maximum out of those dollars is going to be key.
Yeah, so let's pivot to actually tracking grants, because throughout my career, I've seen some great spreadsheets that track grants, drawdowns, filtered by grantee, the purpose it was for. And, working with organizations that are councils of government, we've seen that the problem gets even worse when you can't track the grant by purpose, by member agency, by project is what, for example, FDOT wants. When you take a grant from them, they want to report on every little project by agency. So when you're a council of governments, like Maricopa Association in Arizona or Metro in Oregon, you have to track these grants to the penny by project, by agency. And that becomes a whole other mess because most systems can't do that. They say they
Yeah,
can.
yeah, and you run into situations where your accounting and budgeting are going to be very leery of the grant piece, because if you don't extract the maximum dollar out of that, maybe you go over, or even just sort of planning that with revenues. A lot of organizations still are dealing with major revenue issues that crop up that they have to do a budget adjustment in the middle of the year. Your accounting department tends to be fearful of the fact that if this grant funding doesn't come through, or you go to get reimbursement and suddenly a good portion of the money is gone, well, now it's coming out of the general fund, and now it's yet another revenue issue.
Yeah.
So accounting departments get very conservative, and budgeting will scare electeds as well. They see that as, oh no, this is more of a liability than an assistant. And so you have to understand that, and you have to have that nailed down. This is where a lot of organizations fail. It's not just writing, just writing everything to get the grant itself, and then, well, we'll just keep track of the numbers. I mean, someone also has to see what is happening with the funding, especially in some states. That funding could be swept for one reason or another. It's not always 100% guarantee. So you need to work well with your accounting and your budgeting and your leadership in your organization to make sure that they know what this is and that they're comfortable with. Otherwise, it's just looked at as, okay, well, it's a nice to have. If we can get that, then great, but we're not going to count on it. And I certainly don't want to risk having a revenue issue halfway through budget year if we're exposed to the fact that we may or may not get reimbursement.
Right. And so that brings me to the other point, right? There's grants that give you money, and there's grants that reimburse you money, and you better have your ducks together in a row for the latter case, because you're not going to get money if you've just spent something that isn't really applicable. And we saw this during COVID, right? We did a project on the neighborhood grants that came out of the treasury, and there was no way to track these. And so there was some industry organization built a specific software. Maybe it was a lobbying group that knew that this was coming. They built a piece of software that claimed that it could track this specific grant. And we had to go in and rescue one of our clients from that project because it just fell apart. At the end of the day, they got, I want to say, $60 million to spend in their community, and they had to account for every penny, and the system wouldn't let them do it. And nor would any traditional ERP at the time. I don't know if that's changed, but you were at a client last week. You were telling me that they don't have any way to track grants. Tell us a story about that without naming names.
Yeah, so this is a situation where a large organization, it had one person doing their grant management. They decided to retire the organization, and this is typical, especially in local gov, that they don't do a lot of planning to retain institutional knowledge. And I think a lot of times we bank on the fact that this person, we could lure them back for maybe some hourly or contract work. If they retire, they leave the organization. In this situation, that person wanted nothing to do with that. They were ready to move on. So they lost all that institutional knowledge. This person had built really elaborate spreadsheets that only, quote unquote, they could understand. So it left this gap where not only was, and still grant funding is not being tracked. People are currently guessing. Meanwhile, IT is trying to go through all the spreadsheets and make sense of what this is. There's a number of solutions, and we're talking to that organization. There's a number of ways you can address this, especially with some micro SaaS solutioning, or even some leveraging some AI to get a good grip around that. But I'd love to say that's atypical. That's actually pretty typical, and you're correct. During the days of COVID, a lot of that funding was just usually administered at the state level, even though it was a federal grant. Some organizations got that as money in the bank. They were able to carve out a portion of that pot, sometimes based upon population, some of it depending upon the attention that you can get for your organization at the state level, and actually get that money in the bank first and then spend it. And that's because I believe at the time Congress was more looking at, let's get the funding out there and we'll figure out how to do the reporting later. And a lot of the reporting never came through. It wasn't even included in the legislation that was passed. I think a lot of organizations honestly would benefit from identify who your intergov is. Hopefully you know who that is, and then put your grants management under that particular person. Otherwise, they want to leave it to community development. They want to leave it to finance, or they stick it into some other organization. Sometimes it's under CIP, capital improvement projects. If you can put that skill and that person underneath your intergov, who's actually representing you at the legislature level, I think you can streamline a lot of things. You get things going, and not only understand what the grant is and is not, and get those questions answered, but again, be proactive as to, we have this coming up. We should look at this sort of grant funding. We have a lot of the information as to why we need this. Give that to the intergov to go and lobby on behalf of the organization or the region to secure that grant funding in current or future years.
And we've seen, traditionally grants were for a specific reason. You still have to really justify why you need this money, what you're going to do with it. But during COVID, there was a concept called shovel-ready projects. Fiber money was being spent in large amounts through BEAD, ARPA, you name it, that for the most part didn't go anywhere, right? People strung fiber. It's still dark in some cases.
Yeah.
There was no rhyme or reason or planning on how you're going to deploy this. On the other end, there was no real accountability or mechanism to measure how these grants were being actually used and how impactful they were. We did some great work in Tennessee locally using those funds that our county clients got. We need things like MacNet, where we connected a bunch of communities in a county. It was very, very beneficial to the community, won a lot of awards for the people involved, and it was a good use case or success story of a grant spent well. But we've in that same realm, we've heard of so many communities across the country that got the money but did nothing with it. And this is where I think you mentioned the word sweep. Is that where the granting authority can take the money back? And what have you seen being the success rate of them doing it, and how do they actually um, find out that you didn't actually use the money for the intended purpose?
Well, so you're exactly right. There were a lot of one-time purchases of equipment that sat on the shelf, or they never got fully deployed.
Unopened boxes. Yep.
Yeah, same thing with software. People bought systems that they never even used. Maybe they never went live with it, or they only went live with certain portions of it. And so there are modules sitting out there that were paid for with public funds that have never even been turned on or explored, because everyone, I think the big looming thing is the fiscal year, and looking at, halfway through the fiscal year, we got this grant funding and we haven't done anything on this. How are we going to get this done in the last 6 months? How are we going to get this done in the last 4 months? And if you're down to 2 months, good luck. I don't know how you spin something like that up, other than, do a procurement, find a vendor, throw a bunch of money at them and go, okay, we'll figure this out. We'll figure this out later. There's a variety of ways this can play out, but you're exactly right. There could be a number of situations, including state level revenue issues. There could be regional revenue issues, and suddenly those funds are swept. And then they also take a look at how you're doing your grant tracking and how you're performing on that. And they, in a lot of cases, they could make up arbitrary things that say, if you haven't spent more than 50%, there's no way in heck you're going to get this done by the end of the fiscal year. We're going to cancel, or we're going to sweep a portion of your funds. You want to be proactive about that, not reactive to that. If you're reactive, then it's too late. But if you're keeping the ear of the legislature and going, we are using these funds, they're producing these results, they're probably going to leave your funding alone and keep it intact. The other organizations that are not on top of what they're doing, they're going to be prime targets for, let's sweep first, and if they have questions later, or there are problems or complaints later, too late. You should have kept on track and should have kept on top of how you're progressing with these grant funds. So the legislatures, or maybe it's a regional organization or something through like an MOU or an IGA, intergovernmental agreement, they have fiscal responsibility as well. Is it going to happen every time? No, but you don't want to be surprised by that, because again, especially in economic situations like we've seen the past couple of years, things change very quickly and priorities change very quickly, and things will get swept if you're poor performing or you're not even performing on your grant.
So let's take an audience question. Katie asks, for organizations that don't have a dedicated grant writing team, what's the most practical way to start identifying and pursuing funding opportunities like these? Where do you start?
Intergov. Yeah, Intergov. It really should start with the Intergov. And like I said, almost every organization has someone named, and maybe they don't spend a lot of time down at the state capitol or at county commission, but it really starts there. They're the ones who are going to have the best pulse as to how things are going. They're going to be meeting with people on a regular basis, so they're going to hear what is and is not coming. They're going to hear what problems might occur. How do we shore that up? People get they get overly concerned with the grant writing process or writing the proposal for the process. Those days are gone where you just sort of have to guess and pull as much information as you can, and someone has to sit down and write this all out in long language. It's the first thing that people shy away from when they think of grant funding. I don't have time for someone to spend 2 weeks chasing this grant. It's a different ballgame now, especially with AI. You can go to AI and you can ask, what are grant funding opportunities in my region? And you're probably going to get a pretty thorough report as to what current grants are, maybe potentially what some grants that are being discussed that are coming. You can shortcut a lot of this process with proper use and leveraging of AI. But someone still has to be watching that. Someone still has to understand and have those meetings and get the pulse as to where a lot of this is going. You can't shortcut that process. But again, organizations usually have some form of intergov. That person can certainly take on something along those lines.
And where it's really pertinent to us as a consulting vendor is, can our clients that really need modernization, can they use grants to fund ERPs. And, it's not just a software purchase anymore, right? ERP is fundamental to modernizing operations, to security, to, doing more with less, to being more fiscally conservative with your resources. If you don't have automation, you can't be cyber secure, you can't get your work done more efficiently. So we've seen some creative uses of grant funding to pay for software projects. Like you said, they're not just for hardware purchases or one-time purchases. You can pay for upfront implementation through grant funds. And now with more and more people looking at AI as a solution, as a third option, right? Historically, you had an older system that was homegrown. Your options were stick with it, find the people that can run it, or go to market and spend anywhere from $3 to $20 million to buy a new product or more. And now there seems to be an AI option emerging with micro SaaS, with agentic AI that is third party, that can really pull information from multiple sources, create that grant application quickly, and increase your chances because you may submit to multiple volumes of grants. What was the constraint was human labor should not be anymore. So the point I'm trying to get to is if you can justify ERP funding that doesn't necessarily say this is for ERP, but you're making the case for why we need to use those dollars to buy an ERP system. Are we going to see more of that in along the lines of AI purchases and building agentic frameworks for clients?
Yes, because you have the ability to do thoughtful grant stacking and tracking,
Mhm.
whereas before it seemed rather daunting. You will be surprised. Let's take ERP, probably one of the biggest expenses besides major infrastructure that organizations are going to have coming up. There are several components of ERP. It's not just a software replacement, but you're exactly
Mhm.
right. You can get grant funding to help with the cybersecurity aspect of it. We're really big when we work with our clients to make sure that their cybersecurity team has a strong presence, especially in the RFP and the system evaluation, because that is so critical. You can get a portion of those IT services and that cybersecurity funded through one particular grant. Workforce retraining. The client I was on site with last week is making a major initiative to not only are we going to train people on the new ERP system, we're also going to shore up a lot of their education that maybe they haven't pursued recently, especially if there's any changes. And there's another great tool you can use. Look at a lot of your audits that you've had. If it's a cybersecurity audit, maybe it's your annual external audit for your financials. You can point usually to one or two things in there that they aren't major findings. Maybe they're not an administrative finding, but something that says, hey, you're going to need to take care of this at some point. This is still a major issue. You can tie that to a lot of grant funding that's not ERP related, but it plays out in your ERP system, or it times perfectly with what you're looking to do with ERP. The other thing that organizations get short-sighted on, even in an ideal situation where you put a lot of this grant stacking together, and now you've got 60% of your ERP replacement funded by grant funding, you still got to look at the long-term recurring costs that come with the ERP. Organizations, like I said a million times, especially electeds, love looking at one-time dollars as a solution and don't like looking at the recurring costs that are factored in there as well. And a classic example that you may or may not get grant funding for, but you might be able to, is maintaining that ERP system, the vendor relationship, looking at a regular basis as to, do we need to modify workflows? Do we need to do some retraining? I'm a big believer in retraining. A lot of organizations, that's the first thing they get rid of and it's usually a staffing constraint. It's not cost. It's, I
Mhm.
can't send my finance department to 7 hours of ERP retraining next year because it conflicts with financial season or budget season. You can get grant funding for those particular situations to do a retrain. So not only is it just the one-time purchase and that 1 or 2 year arc of ERP replacement, also looking at what do I need to do in year 3, 4, and 5 to maintain this ERP system so I don't have to throw yet another ERP system out after 4 or 5 years and start all over. Keep re-leveraging and reinvesting in that existing platform that you spent a lot of money on, and you can get some grant funding to help pay for a decent portion of that.
And that that also makes me think of matching funds because grants are never
Hmm.
100%. They are, but not all the time. How do you budget for something you don't know that's coming? So that goes back to the inner gov, your lobbyist relationships, relationships with your elected officials. Uh, Granted, you have to do all of that to be ready for a grant that may be coming out next year so you can budget for the matching dollars. But what's been your experience on finding a grant that's due next week and you have a great shot at getting it, but you may not find the matching dollars?
In a lot of ways, it's too late. So I'm encouraging organizations right now that don't think they have an ERP issue to continue to look at your ERP, continue to look at how it's working. And because you're building a lot of this information in advance and understanding where you are, so then therefore you can plug that need into a grant request or something you're doing lobbying with your legislature as well. Again, the reactive just doesn't work. It becomes a scramble. And then if you do get the grant funding, now the clock is ticking. I need to get this. Um, Especially if someone, so here's another disconnect that often happens. Someone in the organization identifies a grant funding opportunity. Someone says, go
Mhm.
track it down. Let's apply for it. Let's get it. You get it. Now you've got the funding, but you don't have any of the internal resources to actually apply it. And if you don't have the internal resources, what do you want to do next? You want to go out for procurement. Well, procurement takes a long time. So again, being proactive about this, putting continuous thought into this is your best path forward. How to pull it in at the 11th hour? Boy, I tell you, if I had that answer, a lot of governments would be in great shape right now. But the issue we always run into, the lesson we always learn is when you do this from a reactive stance, your opportunities are and your options are very limited. So again, even if you don't think you have a cybersecurity issue, and those are some of the most dangerous organizations, right? We always talk about cybersecurity is carried from moment to moment. It's not
Mhm.
a set it and forget it. Someone has to stay on top of this. Someone also has to be able to identify if we get the grant funding, how are we going to do this? Especially if it's a public safety grant where now you have to bring people in on overtime. Well, now your costs just went up
Yeah.
because you're going to have to bring in officers on overtime to do like a click it or ticket program. There's a variety of public safety ones out there. You're going to run into a resourcing issue unless you do some planning for this in advance.
So, audience question from your experience, are there specific cybersecurity initiatives that tend to attract more grant funding right now?
Yeah, usually the first one is in a region where there's already been a major cybersecurity incident. And if it's a very large city, it wakes a lot of people up. And then suddenly people are like, we need to take this seriously. Especially states. States would rather give you some funding now to solve your cybersecurity issues than to have to step in and bail you out when you have a major cybersecurity incident. So a lot of that is just if you're CIO attending state or regional CIO conferences where you talk about this specifically, interfacing with CIOs and other organizations as well, and understanding, hey, this grant funding's coming this way, you would qualify for this as well. And in some cases, I've seen some state CIO organizations build special sessions, like a half day, where they will all get together and they will brainstorm and they will write up the basis of what this grant is and how they're going to go after it. And if there's some holes in it, who's going to go to the legislature? Who's going to go to that representative and see if we can get that taken care of? Again, those are proactive stances, not reactive stances. So
Mhm.
proactivity is the key here.
So, I think this can answer the next question too. What if you could do just one thing differently to dramatically increase your chance of securing stacked funding for ERP and cybersecurity modernization? What would it be?
Yeah, we talked about this earlier. It's really having a strong intergov that's willing to take that on and get a pulse on that and get understanding as to when that's going to come. Are there any special stipulations? It makes the budgeting process so much easier when your intergov is actually staying on top of those things and then coming back and telling certain departments, grant funding opportunity here for staff retraining. Let's start with HR. Let's talk to finance. Let's talk to some of these other departments as well that can take advantage of this opportunity. It's really going to be intergovs out there are probably yelling at me right now saying, I don't have time to do this. Look at it. You're leaving money on the table. You're leaving
Yeah.
funding on the table. If that doesn't wake you up a little bit, I understand the risks that you're going through and you have a lot of urgent issues that you have to take care of as well. But the risk you're leaving is money's going to be left on the table that your organization could have used and put to really good use.
That's powerful, and it's in line with what we always talk about. No matter what the problem is that you're trying to solve, proper planning, understanding the vision, making sure you're using all the tools available to you is critical. And all of that is in the upcoming book, Start at Zero. It's called that because when you modernize your systems or apply for a grant to modernize systems, you have to really start from the brass tacks. Start from the beginning, understand what your current situation is, because no matter what product you buy, and that includes AI products, they're not going to solve the problem for you. You will be back doing an RFP for another product 2 years from now because this one failed again. And we're seeing that every day. We just had this morning an RFP released by Rochester Public Schools. They've been in a troubled ERP implementation, and they have now decided, looks like, to go back to market. I think less than 2 years after they selected the vendor they went with. Um, all the tips and tricks and tools to avoid that kind of disaster is in the book. And if you're listening to this, start at zero.averoadvisors.com is the page you want to be on to get a signed copy. I only have a few left, but you can also pre-order. With that, Robert, we'll wrap this up. And